Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Facebook Live discussion. My name is Maura Clancy. I'm here at Chisholm & Kilpatrick in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm joined today by Lindy Nash and Emma Peterson, also of the firm. The three of us are attorneys here at Chisholm & Kilpatrick, and today we're going to be talking about special monthly compensation. A couple notes before we get into the substantive material for today. First of all, thanks for joining us, and if at any point you have any questions that you would like to ask, we will be taking questions through the comments feature next to this video. So leave your questions there. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. What we will also do is be sure to post any articles or blog posts from our website that we think would be responsive to your questions, also in the comments feed. So keep an eye on those. And today like I said, we're going to be talking about special monthly compensation, or as we call it, SMC. In general, special monthly compensation is used to pay veterans for disabilities that are exceptional, special, sort of where the name comes from, and usually far and above what the typical scheduler criteria will pay for certain disabilities. So Lindy, can you start us off by giving us an overview, just generally, what is special monthly compensation, or SMC, who is it for, and how does it work? If a veteran is eligible for SMC, how does that affect the other payments that they receive through their typical disability compensation?
Sure. So special monthly compensation, as we've said, SMC, easier to call it that way. So SMC is basically for veterans who have very severe disabilities that have been service connected. So it's usually kind of the point is that if you have multiple service connected disabilities, or even one or two that are so severe that the typical compensation table doesn't really compensate you appropriately. So the VA gives you kind of that higher level, a little bit more in a payment, just to compensate you for how severely disabled you are. So there are multiple types of SMC that we're going to go through. We often refer to them by the letter, and we'll get more into that as well. But basically, when you think of SMC, you kind of think of loss of use or loss of limb, blindness, deafness, things along those lines. Again, we'll get into that in more depth as we go on.
And so if it's the case that a veteran is eligible for SMC, say for the loss of a hand, because as Lindy said, usually SMC comes into play. One of the common ways is through loss of limb, loss of one extremity, a hand or a foot, etc. If a veteran is receiving payments, say they're receiving a 30% monthly payment for the hand, but then they are entitled to SMC based on loss of use of the hand.
Yep.
How do those payments work out? Is the veteran eligible to receive both payments?
Yep. Sure. So typically, for the most part, SMC, that payment will replace whatever you're getting on a monthly basis. However, there is one exception, which is called SMC-K, and we'll get into that more in depth as well. So a K will be added onto your monthly compensation rate. I believe right now an SMC-K is about $108. Again, we'll get into that more in a bit. But SMC-K is added on. However, all other levels of SMC will replace your monthly rate.
And that's typically because the amounts are higher. So.
Yes, yep, exactly. So they're not added on to what you have. It's usually a new rate altogether.
Great. And just for a point of reference, when we're talking about SMC, as I said before, we're talking about more severe conditions. And so as a result, the compensation that's paid through SMC benefits is also higher to match the severity of the conditions that we're dealing with. So just for reference, right now a current 100% rating, a monthly payment for that is about $3,000. But the SMC rates, say for SMCL, which as Lindy said, we'll get back into later what the specific letters stand for. The payment for SMCL is around $3,800 a month. The payment for SMCR1 is around $7,600 a month, and the highest amount for SMC would be R1 and T, I believe, and that is in excess of $8,000 a month. So we're definitely talking about benefits that are more substantial than your typical monthly payments, which is why this is a special form of compensation, as the name implies. So just a reference in terms of how the payments differ, and now we're going to start talking about what the different levels of SMC are. So as Lindy mentioned before, we have SMC-K. We also have, as I mentioned, SMC-L, SMC-R1. Generally speaking, how do we get the letters? So why do we refer to SMC by the letter?
Sure. So in the statute that awards SMC, it goes by subsection letter. The letters are not in order. They don't necessarily correspond to a term or a phrase. Like L is not because of loss of use, it's just L. I'm sure at some point there might have been some sort of correspondence, but really it goes from K, which is the lowest, then you have S, L, O, M, and from there you get to R, and then from R it goes to T, which is the same, but they're sort of not necessarily in any kind of coherent order, but they're building blocks that build on each other.
Okay, so the letters refer, as Emma said, to the different subsections of the statute, which is why we use the letters for shorthand. And typically, although not universally in the progression, because S is the exception, which again we will talk about later, typically the amounts for SMC payments get higher as you go further through the alphabet. So this stuff's very complicated, so bear with us as we go through it all. There's a lot of different subparts and sub-requirements for each level of SMC, and then there are a lot of ways in which the different levels of SMC interact with each other. So as Emma said, they're building blocks. Sometimes you can satisfy the lower levels and build upon those to satisfy higher levels, which would increase your monthly amount. So let's get into some of the specifics. Emma, can you, actually no, I want to start with Lindy because you already started talking about SMCK.
Yep.
I think that's the easiest, so to speak,
Sure.
Type of SMC level to conceptualize. So give us a breakdown of what SMCK is and how it works with other SMC levels, although you did allude to that before, but give us a refresher, please.
Sure. And then actually before I get totally into SMCK, I just wanted to mention, I think we wanted to talk about this, is that when you file for SMC, you might be asking, how do I get there? What do I do? You actually don't have to file specifically for SMC. And I think that's something Emma was going to get into as well. But you don't need to file a specific form for SMC. It is kind of inherent in your increased, whenever you're seeking the maximum rating, you are inherently seeking SMC if you submit evidence that shows that. So that is a question I think we get all the time. How do I get SMC? What do I do? So typically the evidence that you submit should kind of raise that flag for VA. But if you're worried, you can always, call your representative or file something with the RO specifically saying you'd like SMC. But typically you don't have to. Did I miss anything?
No, that's it. That's true for any kind of increase, is that you can always ask for it. Better to be explicit. And just sort of get the ball rolling. But if the evidence raises it, not everyone's going to know the ins and outs of SMC. Like we mentioned, the letters get confusing. We're going to get into half steps. It gets really, really sort of convoluted. So, certainly work with a representative or an attorney or an agent, whoever you talk to about these things. But you can certainly ask for it out front if you want to, too.
Definitely.
But no requirement for a special form, which is really nice
Nope.
When we're talking about these kinds of benefits.
Yes, definitely. So anyway, I just wanted to say that before I forgot. But anyway, so back to SMCK, which is the level that we were talking about before. It is the lowest rate for SMC out there. As I said, it's $108 approximately right now. And typically SMCK is warranted for either loss or loss of use of a body part or organ that a veteran has due to their injury, lost the use of. So again, loss of use, it doesn't have to be amputated. There is no amputation requirement. So you could have it amputated, but that is not necessary for this K to be given to you. Typically, it would be loss of use of one hand, a foot, both buttocks, I believe, a reproductive organ, even breast tissue, and there's all sorts of other examples as well, but those are kind of the ones that I immediately think of. And also just to go on to loss of use, it's kind of, I look to a regulation all the time or a case law to kind of cite what loss of use really means. And I usually think about it as there being no effective functioning remaining. So sometimes VA wants to go back and forth about what that means. And so we would often say that if you have no effective function remaining in that hand or foot or arm, then that would consider loss of use. So that is kind of what I think about that. Oh, and you can also have multiple Ks. That's something important to note as well. So the Ks can add up. You can have, loss of use of the hand and, breast tissue, and that would be 2 different Ks added onto your monthly compensation.
Great. So good to know. So distinguishing features of SMCK, as Lindy said, is that you can receive multiple Ks at the same time. You can stack them, so to speak. And I think that was a good point that you made earlier. There is no amputation requirement. So when we talk about loss loss of use of a particular body part, which we will be talking about a lot today, there's no requirement that the body part be totally gone, no longer attached. So that's good to know.
Yes, absolutely.
Emma, do you want to talk to us briefly about SMCS, what that level of SMC is about?
We'll just go right in. We'll dive in from S, but then we get a backtrack, go to L, M, N, O, P, and then to R. Okay, so we're just going to go through all the alphabet soup we have here.
Yes.
So S is the next step up from K. It's the next high, the first sort of real true SMC level beyond SMCK. And there's sort of two ways that you can get it. The first is if you are housebound, meaning you can't leave your home, your hospital, your care facility, and the medical condition you have that causes you to be housebound is service connected and it's not likely to improve. You can qualify for SMCS. Now that doesn't mean you can't ever leave your house. If you have to go to doctor's appointments or some type of care, that's fine. But it does mean that you pretty much are homebound the rest of the time. You just possibly can't leave due to the nature of your disability. The other way to get SMCS statutorily is if you have one disability that's 100% disabling, and that one disability could cause you to be schedulally 100%. You've been received a rating from a diagnostic code that's 100, or that one disability on its own causes you to be unemployable. So you get TDIU to that single disability. And then you've got more disabilities on top of that combine to at least a 60%. You can also get SMCS. So this is where the building blocks come in and the math gets confusing. But just know that 100%, whether it be scheduler or TDIU, plus a combined 60, will get you SMCS. So that's the next highest level. And you have the rate over there. What's the rate for S?
The rate for S currently for a single veteran with no dependents, that's the point of reference that we usually use, is about $3,400 a month.
All right, so that's definitely $400 more a month up from the scheduler 100. That's certainly significant. And then from there, it just increases. So after S, now we start getting into different body parts needing to combine together to get to the different levels. So we have SMCL, which could be awarded for if you have loss of use of 2 hands, 2 feet, your eyes, your hearing, or you need something called aid in attendance. So those things together, those combinations of things will get you SMCL. And then from there you build even more. So we have SMCM, which has to be loss of both hands, both legs at the knee, one arm at the elbow and one leg at the knee, blindness in both eyes. Blindness requires aid and attendance. So again, it's a little bit more than the L. You have more body parts in play, more conditions affecting your total functioning level. N goes up from there. It just goes to higher levels of loss of use. So for example, if you have loss of use of your arm at the elbow as opposed to your hand, both legs at the hip, you've got one arm at the shoulder, one leg at the hip, or you're completely blind, totally blind. That will get you an N. And then finally we get to O, and you get there by combining L's, M's, and N's. So if you've got 2 L's, if you have 2 M's or N's together in combination can get you to the higher level of O. So it's kind of like a booster. You've got so many conditions that are so disabling that together combined they're going to bump you up to SMCO. And what's O? I think it's...
The rate for O is $5,300.
Okay, so that's definitely exponentially more than the 100%, which is about $3,000. And that is due to the severity of the disability. It's compensating you for that special situation. So as Lindy said, though, the loss of use that we're talking about is not a complete and total amputation. And the definition of loss of use is a little tricky, and it can be hard for doctors to understand. So it's important to talk to your treatment providers and be very clear about, get good medical evidence about what that means. And what it means is that, like Maura said, Lindy said, you have no remaining function. And VA uses the terms that you could be equally or better served by an amputation with a prosthesis. So that can be sort of a hard pill for a medical examiner to swallow. To say, yes, we should amputate, but we wouldn't when amputation is not preferred. But that's really what it means, is that there's no remaining function in that hand or leg or foot. You can't grasp with your hand. You can't walk with your feet. You need support, you need a cane, a walker, a wheelchair, whatever the case may be. So those different combinations really build up together.
And something that you mentioned that is integral in those different levels is the concept of aid in attendance. Tell us what aid in attendance is, how you could suffice that requirement, because that seems to be pretty important in terms of showing eligibility for SMC benefits.
Right. So aid in attendance, it kind of is what it sounds like. You need the aid and attendance of another person to help you carry out, your daily living, daily activities. So if you need help getting dressed in the morning, bathing, hygiene needs, preparing meals and eating, you need someone to help you with the prosthetic or orthopedic device. You can't adjust it on your own. You're bedridden, or you need someone to help protect you from your daily life, the hazards of daily life. So there are folks with, mental health conditions that are so severe that they do need someone else to assist them just with day-to-day living. It's not that they need someone to feed them, but they do need someone to help them to sort of navigate the ins and outs of daily life. That can qualify for aid and attendance. Now, that aid and attendance on its own is that SMC level L. But then if you had another L, let's say, you start building on that and bumping up the level. So I could see a situation where someone who has Parkinson's or Parkinsonisms, needs help. They have loss of use of both legs, but they also need aid and attendance due to their inability to feed themselves. Those two L's together could get them to that SMCO, and then it just ticks up from there.
That makes sense. And one thing that we have seen questions about before about aid and attendance is that or is the question that, is that a benefit that can extend to the caregiver or to the veteran themselves? Is there any ability for a veteran who is eligible for benefits due to aid and attendance, can their caregiver get paid that benefit? Do you know the answer to that?
So aid and attendance gets paid to the veteran. It is paid to the veteran. There are other programs, and that's a different Facebook Live topic to talk about. VA has caregiver programs, but aid and attendance is paid to the veteran themselves.
Great. And so there's clearly so many different levels of SMC in play. Lindy, what happens if there is one specific claimant who is eligible for different types or multiple levels of SMC? How do the payments work in that type of scenario?
Yep. So Emma kind of referenced this, but some of the time, if you have multiple levels of SMC, they can combine together to give you that next level of SMC. So we talked about O. So the level O, you can get O by getting one L through N plus another L through N. And so I know that sounds kind of complicated, and it's confusing. It is. And we, struggle with it all the time, which is why we have our book with us. But basically, so in an example like that, a veteran could be receiving L due to, loss of use for something, extremities, plus L for ANA due to PTSD. So that L plus another L combines to give you an O. And therefore, you don't get two L's. That's not how it works. They combine together to give you that next higher level of O for SMC.
Great. And Emma, earlier you mentioned half steps.
Oh, yeah.
And the possibility that a veteran might be eligible for SMC, but also have different service-connected conditions that don't necessarily warrant the assignment of SMC, but are still rated high enough on the schedule that VA has provided ways for even additional compensation on top of the levels that we've already talked about. Can you walk us through some of the possibilities if someone has other disabilities that qualify for SMC, other disabilities that don't qualify for SMC but are rateable at a certain amount?
Right. So there's sort of two ways to bump up. So let's say you're at SMC L, because we've talked about L a lot. I like L. I'm comfortable with L. So you're at SMCL, but you have other conditions that separately combine to a 50. You can get a bump up to L.5. And if you have other disabilities that are rated at 100%, you can get bumped up a full step to M. I have to do my alphabet, L, M, N, O, P. So you can get bumped up a full step. So there are ways beyond just needing more SMC building blocks to get that kicker up to the next higher level. And that's why this stuff can get very confusing, really mathematical, really technical, a little dry. But at the end of the day, certainly, a really, really important benefit for those that need it, because as we've been talking about, the levels really increase exponentially. And for someone in that situation, that money is really necessary to make sure they're getting the care that they need to help them out with their daily life.
Mm-hmm. And definitely based on the recognition that if you have certain disabilities that are so disabling that they warrant SMC, and there's the possibility that you still have other disabilities that are rated so high, it doesn't make any sense to not receive additional compensation to recognize the whole disability picture and all the impairments that the person has. Lindy, do you want to talk to us about SMCR, which I think we mentioned earlier?
Yep.
We mentioned that the rate for SMC, at least for R1, is about $7,600 a month, and for R2, it's the highest SMC rate at $8,700 a month. Tell us about R1 and R2, and summarize for us, please, the difference between the two, because this is yet another subsection of SMC that can get kind of complicated.
Yes, definitely. So as Maura said, there are kind of two sections to R. There's R1 and there's R2. So we'll start with R1. Basically, you get to R1 by having an SMCO or an SMCP plus regular aid and attendance. So we've talked about this, previously. I don't have to get back into what O and P stand for, but say a good example is a veteran would be wheelchair bound due to loss of use of both of his feet. So that would give you SMCL. However, he or she also has PTSD, which requires ANA to give you another L. So that gets you to O. So once you have that O and ANA, that gets you to R1. But the most important thing to know about R1 is that you might think to yourself, oh, that sounds like pyramiding, that ANA is used for both the PTSD and the ANA that you need to finish the R1. However, under the regulation 3.350, it's actually not pyramiding and it's not overlapping, and it's okay in this situation. So that's a really good thing to know going forward, and another nuanced thing that's really easy to miss and that the VA can often mess up. So it's important to really go through that slowly and recognize that you could qualify for R1.
And that's really the only situation in SMC where you can sort of double dip.
Yes.
You
exactly.
can't have an L for loss of use of your lower legs and then an L for ANA due to the loss of use of your lower legs. And those two L's together won't kick you up to the O. So it's only once you reach O can you double dip and use the ANA to boost you to R1.
Yep, exactly. So that's R1, and then R2 is just a little bit, actually it's a much higher benefit, as Maura said, compensation-wise, but really the big difference from R1 to R2 is that the ANA required for R2 must be by a licensed medical professional. So, if your husband or wife has been taking care of you and they qualify for ANA, they're not a registered physician. They're not a medical professional. They just help you, with your day-to-day life. That will qualify as regular ANA. However, if you have a, nurse coming in to check on you every day, or I think even if your spouse is a nurse, that can technically qualify as a medical licensed professional. So that would be R2. So that's really the big difference, is that for ANA in R2, they have to be a licensed medical professional, whether that's, your child or a spouse or someone you hire from a organization. That would be the big difference.
Great. And finally, Emma, will you walk us through SMCT, which is also paid at the same rate as SMCR2 that Lindy just discussed? Again, that rate is right around $8,700 a month. Tell us what the requirements are for T.
Sure. So SMCT is newer. And that's in recognition of sort of the severity of folks coming out with traumatic brain injuries from the service, and just sort of the all-encompassing nature of TBIs. They can manifest in so many different ways, affect your body so completely. So SMCT is for those people who are service-connected for a TBI and they need aid and attendance due to that TBI. But they don't have the other building blocks to get to that R level. They don't have, let's say loss of use of the legs and the hands and the feet. They just have a very severe TBI that requires aid and attendance. And if that care is the only thing keeping them from not having to go into a facility for full-time care, they can qualify for SMCT, and it gets paid out at the R2 level. So if you have a TBI that requires aid and attendance and you don't otherwise qualify for R2, and again, that aid and attendance is the kind that is basically someone's caring for you and helping you with your daily life. And if it wasn't for that care, you'd have to go into a facility. You can qualify for SMCT. So again, it's in recognition of sort of just the severity and how globally a TBI can affect a person's body.
Definitely. So we've gone through a lot of the steps here. Again, thanks for bearing with us. This stuff is very complicated. There's math involved. There's a lot of weird strategy involved in terms of, which disability is causing which effect and how does that affect your entitlement to higher levels of SMC. So I think a big takeaway from what we've talked about today is this is not something that you have to fill out a particular form for to apply for. If you're seeking a higher rating for a service-connected condition, SMC is what we call an inferred issue. So if the evidence raises your entitlement, then VA is supposed to award you the benefit on that basis. But again, as Emma said earlier, definitely can't hurt if you feel like you are entitled to one of these levels of SMC that we've been talking about, to bring that issue to the attention of your representative or the regional office even, to make it known that you are seeking that benefit explicitly. Although there is no specific form required, which is nice, since sometimes the forms can be just yet another avenue to have to navigate. Did either one of you want to add anything from what we've talked about?
I think it's like any other increased rating claim we talk about, making sure that you have evidence to help you out, whether that be through lay statements of your family members, are very helpful in SMC cases. And to the best of your ability, your own personal experience, lay evidence and medical evidence from any doctors that you see is very important to gather. VA will help you. They'll assist you with that, especially for the ANA and the Housebound. They do have special exams, those disability benefit questionnaires that we all know and love. They will fill those out for those two conditions to talk about it. But just gather as much of your own personal experience evidence as you can, and that can only help as opposed to hurt.
I think that's a great point, especially the addition about the importance that lay evidence can have in these kinds of cases. So evidence that comes from the person that's affected by the disabilities or people that know the person and observe the effect of these kinds of disabilities can be very helpful in these kinds of claims. Did we have any questions?
I would just add one quick thing. I don't know if we actually mentioned the statute. Did we give the number?
We didn't give the number. We just talked about it vaguely.
Well, just in case you want to check it out for yourself, it's 38 U.S. Code 1114. So you can go there. You can check out all the different types of SMC. Again, it's all by letter. So it is complicated, but it's there for you to look for yourself. And you can feel free to contact us with questions. But it is there for you, so you can look at it at home.
Great. It's a good way to wrap it up. Thank you guys for joining me, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope that this was informative. Check back through the comments and see if there's any information that we've posted in addition to this video that would be helpful to you and would answer your questions about SMC. And again, thanks again for joining us today.